Hello, I'm Dale Robbins from the Eubank Church of Christ in Eubank, Kentucky, and we're glad to have you with us today as we begin another lesson in our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. We have been using Mike Willis's workbook as a guide to our study, and today we are looking at lesson 6. In chapters 5 and 6 of the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon has been talking about wealth and the management of it, and how that oftentimes we have some very big misconceptions about both being poor and being rich and the hand of God in all of this. As we looked in chapter 5 last week, we find that Solomon was making the point that man has a continued struggle with his stuff. In verse 12 of the 5th chapter, he made the point that a man may be increased in goods, but that also increases his overhead. There are more obligations, there are more duties, there are more bills to pay, even though he has been increased in goods. The responsibility expands. Also, he noted in chapter 5 and verse 12, as he compared the plight of the laborer with the situation with the rich man. The laborer puts in a full day's work, lays his head down to rest, has his basic necessities in life, his rest is sweet. The rich man, on the other hand, has a restless, fitful night because it's filled with worry of those who might try to take advantage, someone who might steal the wealth. How am I going to manage all of this? And they have their own set of worries. It is sad, but in our culture today, we seem to have voices saying that the rich people have it easy. They have all these blessings, and the poor people are just always going to be miserable. Well, these verses are helping us to understand, as the Apostle Paul taught us, we are to find contentment in wherever we are, in whatever station in life we find ourselves. God may bless us with a whole lot. We may have minimal means by which to get by, but our job, as we'll notice through Solomon's instruction, is to make the best of the situation wherein we find ourselves. Because one day, as Solomon makes the point here in chapter 5, we're going to leave it all behind. And then someone else is going to have it to deal with. And all of our efforts were somewhat for naught. But the point that he leaves us with in chapter 5 is that we've got to remember, where is the source of our wealth? Where does all this come from? Is it because of our own personal magnificence? No, it's because they are gifts from God. Beginning in verse 18 of the 5th chapter of Ecclesiastes, it says, "Behold that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink, and to enjoy the good of all of his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart." We're moving on to something so much better. Heaven will be so much better than this life that we'll hardly remember the travail that we went through here. Or, contrariwise, we won't remember the lavish lifestyle and all the good blessings that we had here, because it's nothing to be compared with the life after this one in the blessings of heaven. But as we move into the 6th chapter, Solomon begins to talk about this wealth in other ways. Here he mentions the idea of our being given these gifts of God, and to be able to have that riches and wealth, and has the power to eat thereof. That's a wonderful thing. But not everyone has such a lifestyle, and sometimes their choices lead them to another path of life. We find here in question 1, he says, in what sense does God give riches, wealth, and honor? It isn't just an immediate ding, and one day you wake up and the cupboards are full and money's laying everywhere, and now you've been abundantly blessed. But rather, God works through other means to give us that which we have. He's given us the ability, both physical and mental, to devote ourselves to some kind of honest labor to earn our portion here in this life. He gives us the opportunity. He helps construct those job openings and to help us get the jobs that he feels we need to have, that which is best for us. All of that is in the hand of God. and for us to be able then to be satisfactory to others, and to gain the favor of man, so that we can experience success and accumulate the riches and the wealth and the honor. That all comes as a result of God's support of us and his care for us. I think of the story of Jacob. When Jacob left his homeland and went and lived with Laban, his uncle, he really had nothing when he arrived. But through the good graces of Laban, with them having a good relationship, Jacob left there years later a very wealthy man with a big family. He was able to gain favor in Laban's sight, and his portion of animals reproduced very, very effectively. He handled his jobs well, and he left there a very wealthy man. God had blessed him in a variety of different ways. In question 2, what evil is discussed in the first 6 verses of chapter 6? It says, there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men, a man to whom God hath given riches and wealth and honor, so that he wanteth nothing for his soul of all that he desireth. Yet God giveth him not power to eat thereof, but a stranger eateth it. This is vanity, and it is an evil disease. If a man beget 100 children, and live many years, so the days of his years be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and also that he have no burial, I say that an untimely birth is better than he. For he cometh in with vanity, and departeth in darkness, and his name shall be covered with darkness. Moreover, he hath not seen the sun, nor known anything. This hath more rest than the other. Yea, though he live 1,000 years twice told, yet hath he seen no good. Do not all go to one place? Now we looked at the ending of the last chapter, to the individual who was abundantly blessed and was able to partake of it, was able to enjoy the blessings of the fruit of his labor. But notice the evil he talks about here. He says, what about the man who has the riches, the wealth, and the honor, so that he wants nothing, but something happens where he does not have the power to partake of it? Maybe his health deteriorates. Maybe something happens that his wealth is taken away, or some other calamity befalls him, and he winds up with a stranger eating it. It's given to somebody else. It goes as an inheritance to another generation or such. Even though he worked to accumulate the riches, the wealth, and the honor, he never saw the benefit of it. And that happens in many, many situations. He goes on here and makes the point that these riches are not going to satisfy us. They are uncertain at best. In question 2, where he said, what evil is discussed? Well, there you can have the adversity of not being able to get satisfaction from your riches, and indeed they are uncertain. In question 3, he says, what 2 illustrations of this evil are cited? Well, one of them is, yes, you accumulated the wealth and the riches and the honor, but then something happened to you where you never got to partake of it, you never got to enjoy it. A stranger was going to be the one to partake. And Solomon says this is vanity, it is an evil disease. That evil disease is interesting. It may be that you wind up seeing this categorized as a disease, that you don't get to enjoy the fortune. Maybe it is that you actually suffer physical disease and are not able to partake of all that you've tried to provide. Either one of those things can happen. But then he even goes on down further, as he talks in verse 3 about the individual who has been abundantly blessed. I mean, he's got a whole host of children. I think there is some hyperbole here to have 100 children, and he may live many years, so that the days of his years be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and also that he may have no burial. In other words, there are some who wind up suffering. They don't even have a decent burial. They wind up being lost in all different frames of way. So here you have this long life that is a life of travail and a life of struggle. So all of these things are pointing out that the riches in and of themselves do not give you a wonderfully fulfilled, utopian, perfect life. Yes, it can make life good. The gifts of God can be enjoyed. We saw that in the 5th chapter. But here in chapter 6, he's saying it doesn't always work out that way. In question 4, to what is the one who suffers this evil compared? Here we're talking about this evil of the individual who lives many years and has many kids, but the days of his years be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and he has no burial. Here's the individual whose life has not worked out well. Things did not go as planned. The goals were not reached, and the wealth brought no satisfaction. All right, so somebody in that plight, he compares them to a child that is stillborn. That's what he's talking about here in verse 3, to an untimely birth. A child can be born and does not experience any of those things. He or she does not even see the light of day. He cometh with vanity, departeth in darkness. His name shall be covered with darkness. That child never sees the breath of life, never sees the light of day, never experiences all the goodness. Here this man experienced life, but it was a hard life, and it was a difficult life, full of disappointments. His reputation is not good. He does not have rest. The only common factor here between these two is what he says in verse 6. Do they not all go to one place? What he's making, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, but they are all going to have one factor in common. We're all going to die. As Hebrews 9:27 teaches us, that it's appointed a man once to die, and after this the judgment. Our life is but a vapor. It appears for a little time. It vanishes away. So whether you are the wealthy person who partook of that good, whether you are the common laborer who just was satisfied with his life, or whether you were the individual who had travail all the way through, maybe long life, but it was a long, hard life, or the stillborn child. In all cases, we go to one place, if the Lord tarries, and that's to experience death. So we find in question 5, he said, cite an example of someone you know to whom this has happened. For example, someone who's worked and worked and worked all of their lives, and then they retired, and then shortly after that, their health deteriorated and they very quickly died. Somebody else got to eat of all of that wealth that they accumulated. My grandfather is an excellent example of a man who worked hard, was abundantly blessed of God, and he was a very affluent man before he passed away. But when he got to about retirement age, he was stricken with arthritis, and it was a crippling arthritis, and back in those days they didn't have much medication to help out with that, and it wasn't long till he was hardly able to get out of the house. And so he did not have those joyful days at the end. He had to turn the farm over to somebody else and simply lived out his days until he finally fulfilled his time. But it was not filled with the joys that he would like to have experienced, the joys he kind of envisioned happening one day whenever he was finally able to slow down some. So that does befall many people. In question 6, what do verses 7 through 9 teach about man's appetite? Let's look. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. For what hath the wise more than the fool? What hath the poor that knoweth to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. The point that he makes here is in verse 7, the appetite's never filled. We can eat a great meal today, but we'll still be hungry tomorrow. We may have a tremendous amount of abundance, but we're still going to want more. Man's appetites are not going to be quenched. And whether we are the wise man or whether we are the fool, we still have dreams. We're still plotting and planning. We're still wanting to move forward with life. And all of that, as we've just noticed, is going to be cut short for us when our days here have ended. We all go to the grave. And as we go through all of these contortions here in this life, we find that we often fail to stop and smell the roses, to see the blessings that God's given and all the abundant things that he has given into our hand. Notice there in verse 7, at the labor of a man, all the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. He works to satisfy his appetites. We work to put food on the table. We try to provide for our own. We try to do those things that we can to accumulate some wealth, as Paul told the Ephesians, so that we may have to give to those who are in need. But it's a never-ending process, because the appetite never is full. There's always more that we're looking toward. In question 8, what two things are compared in verse 9? He says, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. We can look at things and admire their beauty. We can look at the things that other people have and be glad for them, that they have been so abundantly blessed. And we can see things that maybe we would like to one day have for ourselves. We can see and we can dream, and we can make plans. We can execute those plans and maybe attain some of those goals. But in contrast to that, you have the individual who has the wandering of the desire. He always has another quick, rich scheme. How can I get my money together without doing any work? How am I going to get rich quick? There, I got it out right. He's going to get rich quick doing something or another, and then that pasture isn't green enough and there's some other thing he wants to do. He is chasing rainbows constantly. He always has that new investment. He always has that sure bet. He is always jumping around with never a satisfaction. In question 9, he says, what does verse 9 teach? He says, at the end, this is also vanity and vexation of spirit. Whenever you are chasing rainbows all of your life, never making a plan, setting goals, and working to attain those things, life becomes very futile. It becomes one failure after another, because we did not manage well the talents that we'd been given. Over in question 10, he says, what are some of the rainbows that men are chasing? Well, maybe it is riches, wanting to find some way to get rich. And what can I do that's going to give me a fortune? And usually they want a shortcut to get that without the necessary labor. Maybe it's possessions, the idea that I want more stuff. I need a bigger house. I need more cars. I want a boat. I need this. I need that. I want the other. And so they're chasing after all of these dreams, only to find that they're impossible to attain, or that's not their portion in this life. And so they are frustrated by not being able to see those goals reached. Maybe it's the idea of fame, to be famous and to have a reputation and to have everyone look up to you. But then when you've not demonstrated worthiness on your part, that reputation's not going to come. And there are some folks who are craving power. They want control. They want to tell everybody else what to do. They want to be the one that everyone kowtows to, that everyone is going to have to obey. And so they will try to do whatever they can to attain that position of power. All of these things help us to understand it's not God's plan. God will give us our portion in this life. Set your goals, pray for God's guidance, implement your goals, and see what God will bless you with, and then be content with that, as opposed to always at registering some dissatisfaction and chasing after another rainbow. And he goes on to say in question 11, who is him that's talked about in verse 10? Let's look at that. That which hath been is named already, and it is known that it is man. Neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. There's always going to be somebody else on up the ladder, more powerful than us. But maybe we can contend and work with them, and maybe outfox them a time or two. But we're not going to get the upper hand on God. That is the him, I believe, that is mightier than he. He is the potter, we are the clay. We're not going to get a step ahead of God. We're not going to be able to change and get around him some way to satisfy ourselves without his blessing. And so he is mightier than us, and we need to remember that. We are in no position to contend with him. That was something that Job stated several times in the book of Job, that he's not in a position to argue with God because God is so much greater than man. Remember, God's the one who gives the wealth. God's the one who gives the riches and the honor. It is a gift from him. In question 12, what does neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he actually mean? Well, sometimes we develop strategies where we think we can argue with God, badger God enough, or even badger others enough that somehow we can manipulate to get what we want. Maybe if we just keep whining and complaining, folks will give us what we want. Maybe if we're not sure, there's always doubt, there's always a shortcoming, there's always another problem, that maybe people will concede, dote on us a little bit, give us extra provision, try to ease that doubting and ease that fear as we are really just grabbing for attention. Or it may be that we develop the strategy of impatience. I want everything, and I want it now. And so we're demanding of God and of others that through our complaining or through our doubts or through our impatience, a special provision should be made for us. Well, as Solomon is teaching us, there's no value in contending with God. He's mightier than we are. And developing those strategies to strive to manipulate God and man is not going to work for our betterment. In question 13, how is man helped and or hurt by his complaining against God's providence in his life? It's not going to avail anything. As you noticed here in verse 10, neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. You know, everything, God knows all that's going on. He knows us inside out. And he says here, that which hath been is named already, and it is known that it is man. We have our limitations. There's a limit to what we can do. There's a limit to what we can control. And so whining and complaining about it is not going to change anything. Our job is to fear God and keep his commandments, as Solomon tells us at the end of this book, and rely on God to supply our needs as he sees fit. Because God is mightier than we are, and these strategies are not going to move him as they come from a heart of disobedience. In question 14, put in your own words what verse 12 is teaching. Let's look at verse 12. For who knoweth what is good for man in this life? All the days of his life, of his vain life, which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? What's he saying here? Let's go up and add verse 11 to this. He says, seeing that there be many things that increase vanity, what is man the better? Where does this all wind up? He says, well, for who knows what is good for man in this life, all the days of his vain life, which he spendeth as a shadow. The point is, we can't see the big picture. God's going to give us the blessings that we need. And we may be very discouraged with that. Whenever we can't control, there are things out of our control, and things don't go as we want, we can become discouraged and just sort of throw up our hands and say, well, life is just vanity, what's the use? But what the point is being made here in verse 12, we just don't know when our fortunes may change, how things might be turned around, how some repentance and reform on our part could lead to different conclusions. There's just too many things that we don't know. So our job is to not worry about the if and when and then, but rather, let's take it one day at a time. Be the best that we can be. Fear God, keep his commandments, do what he's told us to do, so that the blessings can rain down upon us, and suddenly we see things filling up for us. Things that we never expected to happen. God is the master of surprise. And in question 15, he says, what does the man who criticizes God's provincial government think about his wisdom and God's wisdom? Well, what happens here is man sometimes thinks he's just too smart. And so he, rather than criticizing God's wisdom and God's plan and what he's chosen to do, we need to respect God's wisdom, understand that all things work together for good, as Paul told us in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. And so let's see where God's going to go with this. Yes, there may be a period of travail and adversity, Maybe there is a proving that's got to take place, a thinning out of things, a disposal of that which is getting in our way. We just don't know how all these factors can work together for good. But rather than to be so quick to criticize and doubt, we need to trust in God, respect His wisdom, because we certainly are inadequate. We're not going to know what's about going to happen tomorrow. As he says here, his vain life which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell what shall be after him under the sun? There are factors that we can't control. We don't know how long we're going to live. We do not know all the blessings that may come to us. We may not understand all the hardships that we have to face. So trust in God, hold to his hand, and he will see you through it. Let's look at the true-false questions here at the end. Question 1. The brevity of man's life is emphasized by its comparison to a shadow. Well, that's what he mentioned here in verse 12. It's like James says, it's like a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. We're not here for very long. We may have a lifespan that numbers into 100 years. But think about all the thousands of years that this earth has existed. Time before us and time that may come after us. We're just a little blip on the radar during that time. Number 2, the stillborn child is better off than the man who cannot enjoy the good things in life. That's true. That's the point that Solomon made in that comparison between the man who went through a life of travail and then the stillborn child. The stillborn child didn't have to go through all that travail. So there in verse 3 he explains it, that the stillborn child is better off than the man who cannot enjoy the things of this life. That's true. Number 3, one of the ways in which God punished Israel for their sins was to deny them the power to enjoy the prosperity of their land and to give it to foreigners instead. Several verses are listed here to talk about that promise. In Deuteronomy 28, that's exactly what God said would happen. And we can go through and look at the history of Israel and see all those times when invaders took the land. When before Gideon drove them out, he was thrashing his grain in secret, hoping not to be caught by the Midianites and have everything taken away. So that was the kind of struggle that sometimes happens when we disregard God's plans. There are consequences for that. In question 4, he says, everything which happens to man is predetermined by God, and so he should not struggle against God. I didn't like that question. There were some aspects of it that were kind of bothersome to me. It is true that God knows how everything is going to unfold. He has perfect knowledge of everything and the ability to bless us with all things. And so we need to strive to understand his will and to be the beneficiaries of that. And so in that sense, the statement could be true. But then it says everything which happens to man is predetermined by God. Well, there's a sense in which God's providence could be changed through our prayers. And what may have been one course of action gets changed by God to go a different direction. We don't know how that's going to come down exactly. So there's an aspect of that question where I had a little problem myself. So I would take true or false, either one, for an answer for number 4. And then number 5, the demanding desires of mankind are present in all, the rich, the poor, the wise, and the foolish. And in these 2 chapters, Solomon has made that abundantly clear. That we all have good points, we all make our mistakes. There are some who make more mistakes than others. There are some who refuse to acknowledge God's hand in the planning of all things. But there are some desires of mankind, the dreams that we have, that are pretty well common across the board as the things that we need to sustain our lives and to have that which God provides for us. Many of the wise man and the individual who has got some sense about him sees the blessings of God and is satisfied with those. But many of these other categories have the desires, but they don't see God fulfilling them. In the fill in the blanks in question 1, the one place in verse 6 to which all go is a reference to the grave. That's the point. That is the commonality of that stillborn child and the man who lives in travail. But it's also noted earlier on in this, it is the end for even the rich man and the poor man and the common laborer. For all of us one day will leave this life. Our bodies will go back to dust, and the spirit goes back to the God that gave it. Solomon explains it that way in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes. And then the last question. The fact that Joseph was present in Egypt and was able to help his brethren in a time of famine is an excellent example of God's providence. That's the way God worked things out. He providentially put Joseph in Egypt to be the right man at the right time for the survival of Jacob, his father, and all of his brethren. We see the hand of God at work. No one, and Joseph himself, would not have seen this at the beginning as he was being carried down there in a slave caravan, but God had big things in store. It just took a while for them to come to fruition. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the study today in this sixth lesson out of the book of Ecclesiastes, which coincidentally lined up with chapter 6 in the book of Ecclesiastes. So we hope that you enjoyed the study today, and we'll look forward to having another study next week, Lord willing, and we hope that you can join us then. Thank you for joining us today.